So this lecture is about stress. I mean, we've all experienced stress. We get stressed by school, you get stressed by this class, but sometimes that stress can get chronic. It can happen over an extended period of time, and it can really do a lot of damage to your health and to a person's health, depending on how they interpret that stress. So in this lecture, we're just going to go over some basics of the ideas of stress and a little bit about the physiology. Well, here's some statistics. You know, we actually live in a more stressful environment today. 75% of people say they feel great stress 1 day a week. Now, this is up. This is up from the 1980s, where 55% of people said they experienced this level of stress. So one of the things you can do if you go into the field of psychology, into a practicing psychologist or psychiatrist, is help people to manage their stress, and you can do wonderful things to help them be more healthy. It's been estimated that 75 to 90% of all visits to primary care physicians are for stress-related problems. Now that's really interesting, because you have to understand that the field of psychology and the field of medicine overlap in a lot of ways. And if you can reduce stress, or at least people's interpretation of stress or their managing of stress, you're going to not only save them time, they're going to have a higher quality of life, but they're not going to be going to the doctor as much and having medical related issues. Okay, so a few terms, right? Strain occurs when our resources, our time, our energy, our motivation, our money, are not adequate to reach a positive event or avoid a negative event. Okay, that's a clinical definition, but you know what it's talking about, and we all experience. Don't have enough time to get our work done. Don't have enough money to get the things that we want. This is problematic. Now, coping refers to behavior intended to meet life's demands. This is dealing with those strains. We call it coping. You've heard that. Coping mechanisms. Well, these are psychological terms. Stress is a response to events that are threatening or overly demanding. Okay, so when we're not coping in a way to deal with the strains of life, we experience stress. Sometimes that's very moderate, and sometimes that's severe. Now, what happens when our demands, our coping mechanisms, don't deal with the demands placed on us? Well, these stress events, while good in the short term, can be kind of damaging in the long. It can affect allergies. It can affect your immune system, your inability to ward off diseases. This is a whole field called psychoimmunology or psychoneuroimmunology. We get headaches. Sometimes those are muscle strains in our forehead, muscle aches, sleep disturbances. You know, you're just so stressed about something, you have a hard time getting to sleep at night, you wake up early, you wake up thinking about it, you go to bed thinking about it. This is not a healthy way of being. And of course, when we have physiological reactions to stress, we oftentimes take what is needed to deal with that stress, and we move it away from the digestive system, such as blood, and we'll talk about that in future slides, but it really can affect how we're digesting foods, but also affect the foods we eat. And with stress becomes hypertension, high blood pressure, that leads to cardiovascular disease, kidney disease, these kinds of things. These are serious events about stress. Well, the psychological symptoms of stress, you got to understand stress, depression, and anxiety, they can go hand in hand. Remove stress and you can oftentimes reduce anxiety and anxiety disorders. Depression, helplessness, this is very important. We're going to talk about this in a later lecture about helplessness and learned helplessness. Of course, irritability, I think we all know that one. And also chronic stress, being stressed all the time, can affect your confidence, you get low self-esteem. Sometimes that manifests itself in fear and anger and depression. And one of the things that is a real big causer of stress in many human beings is boredom. Think about that for children. Think about children who are bored in school, or they come after school, there's nothing to do and they're bored. They actually have stress responses to that, and that can be very unhealthy, and it can affect their motivation to do well. And when it gets really bad, we get stress, depression, anxiety, and suicide. Now, this is also really important to understand, that stress is a physiological reaction in our body. We'll talk about that more. But it leads to behavior that can be very destructive, maladaptive behaviors. So one of the number one anxiolytics that people take, an anxiolytic is a drug used to reduce anxiety and stress, anxiolytic. The number one anxiolytic is alcohol. People take this to reduce stress. Sometimes that's okay. A glass of wine, a beer, that can reduce stress, and that's perfectly healthy. It's when it becomes a necessity that we have problems. Of course, drugs, smoking. I gave a survey to a class one time. I said, what do you do? What are these maladaptive behaviors that you do when you're stressed? And somebody says they get dressed while driving their car. That's a maladaptive behavior. Don't do that. People crash. Caffeine drinks. Okay? This used to be a real problem of mine. The more stressed I was, the more caffeine drinks I would have, and these got a lot. And of course, poor diet. We are influenced to eat comfort foods that are high in fats and high in simple sugars and high in salts, the more we're stressed. And I think we've all experienced the kind of food that you eat during finals week. And then, of course, poor sleep. And we know some of the problems of sleep especially with a developing brain, especially with adolescents. Adolescents that are overstressed at school or whatever, and they have sleep problems that can also lead to other things like anxiety and depression and poor performance. And of course, poor productivity. And this is really important, especially for companies. A lot of companies are working really hard to reduce the stress of their employees, not because they want to be really nice, although that's a motivating factor. It's because they just get more work out of their employees. I think places like Google, where they have recreational activities and they have food available to their workers whenever they want it. Create an environment that has a good level of stress. I'm not saying no stress is the best way to go. A good level of stress and you get high productivity. People do serious research in that area. So when we talk about the biology of stress, stressors are events that have an arousing event on us, a stressor. Okay? Now this goes back to just about all animals. All animals have stressors in their life. Usually it's predators or it's competition or whatever. It produces stressors. The stress response are behavioral, the action the animal takes, including humans, and the physiological processes that cope with those events. And I think we'll talk about those in greater detail coming up. The stress response, physiological, behavioral. So acute stress. Okay, wait. That's not acute stress. That's just acute. Okay, sorry. Acute stresses are stressors that happen quickly. The stress happens, there's a fast reaction to it, the reaction takes place physiological, behaviorally over a course of a few minutes or half an hour, and then it goes away. Okay? So, here's a zebra, it's walking around, it's minding its own business, a lion comes and chases it. That's an acute stress. That's acute stressor. The animal runs away, and either it gets killed by the lion, and then that's done, or the lion doesn't get him and the stressor is over. Acute stress. The brain signals the adrenal gland, which just sits right above the kidney, and it releases two types of substances. It releases cortisol, it releases adrenaline. Adrenaline is very fast. It's a fast reaction. Gets into the blood, gets to the heart rate. We've all experienced that fluttering in our stomach, that fluttering in our chest. That's adrenaline kicking out. Okay? We increase blood pressure. Think about that zebra. Why is blood pressure important? Well, because it's running and it needs a lot of blood to a lot of areas of its body very quickly. So blood vessels constrict. They get smaller, so that increases the pressure. Heart rate increases, eyes dilate, you get general arousal from the reticular formation. Okay, heart rate increases, eyes dilate. You want a bunch of information into the brain, so the eyes dilate. These are all acute stressors. Physiological responses to stressors, I think is a better way of saying it. You know, I have a laboratory where I do this work. I'm interested in acute stress because these are fast reactions of the body to stress. Now, when I bring students into my lab, they're not doing the stressors that are like, I don't jump out with a snake or anything. It's just they play games. They play games on a computer. They make decisions. When they make decisions that are uncertain, they don't know if they're going to have a good outcome, like a little gambling decision. It's a little stressful. Not terribly stressful, but I have a machine. It's called, it's from the Biopack company, and it looks for the even slightest changes in heart rate. It looks for the slightest changes in perspiration on the fingers. These are acute stressors. So that's a galvanic skin response. It's electroencephalography or electroencephalogram that measures heart rate, ECG, and electromyograph, which I put on people's foreheads, because when they make a stressful decision or they get feedback of something they like or they don't like, they get an arousal level where they have a skin response or an ECG response or an EMG response, and I can look at that and I correlate these acute stressors, stress responses, these acute stress responses to different types of decision, different types of behavior. Okay, so in an acute stressor, a lion chasing the zebra, or you are riding your bike and it's really nasty traffic and you almost get hit by a car. These are stressors, but they can be even smaller things, like you're in class and the teacher says, okay, what's the answer, and points to you. It's a little bit of a stressor. You have the fast reaction, which is the adrenaline, but you also have a slow reaction, which is also releasing things from your adrenal gland, and this time you're releasing cortisol. Okay? This reaction starts from the brain and has the hypothalamus releases adrenocorticotropic hormone from the pituitary gland. The hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases ACTH. ACTH goes in the blood, goes down to the adrenal gland, and causes the release of cortisol. ACTH goes to the adrenal gland, causes the release of cortisol. Cortisol, it does many, many things. It is a very good hormone released from the adrenal gland that affects many things, and it's very good for stress. It helps that zebra get away. It helps you survive. It helps you deal with stressful events. It, for example, says for glycogen to be converted back into glucose. It helps that process. So now you have extra sugar in your blood, and that's helpful. It helps converts fats to energies. Good. You're running away. You need those energies. Increases blood pressure, helps in that constriction of the blood vessels. But, it can do some other things as well. I mean, it's a very good thing, but if you're having a lot of cortisol, well, you're very stressed. This isn't the best time to bring an offspring into the world, and it actually will reduce sex hormones. People who are chronically stressed, a few things happen. For men, they might have low sperm count, but they also might have less motivation for sexual activity. Same with females. Affects the hippocampus. The hippocampus has to do with converting short-term to long-term memory. It hyperactivates the hippocampus. So does adrenaline. Why? Because you probably should remember what just happened, because it was a stressful event. If you're a zebra, you should remember, hey, don't walk over by those trees over there. There are lions over there. Remember these events. And so the hippocampus is hypersensitive to cortisol and hypersensitive to adrenaline. The problem is if you have a lot of cortisol over a long period of time, it doesn't just go away, it can begin damaging some things. So a lot of cortisol and you're going to have high blood pressure, but that high blood pressure is going to be chronic. That is not good. Short-term blood pressure, hypertension, good. Long-term, bad. Muscle damage, diabetes, because it's affecting your sugar levels, infertility, inability to grow, children who are in very stressful environments. And by the way, this can be a moderate stress can cause these things. It depends on you interpret it. But think about children raised in a war-torn environment. There's war going on. They're chronically stressed. They have problems with just simply growing, right? Reduced healing. Your immune system isn't working. Compromised immune system. And memory loss or inability to form new memories. We see this with people with post-traumatic stress disorder who have chronic stress. Sometimes they have problems with memory and remembering things. Here's an experiment, a very simple experiment. The two groups of people. One group in blue are caregivers. They're caregivers to family members with Alzheimer's. A horrible, terrible way of dying, and it is terribly stressful for those who care for them. And then you have a control group. And they were given these little wounds on the back of their hand, just a little cut, right, in a controlled environment. And then it just looked percentage of fully healed wounds. And you can see, very simple, that if you're in this chronic stress situation with caregiver, you're a caregiver, you are not going to heal as quickly. This is an important thing that I want to say over and over and over again. When it comes to stress, it's not just, it's just in your mind. It's just a psychological thing. Stress is a physiological thing. Behavior and situations and lifestyles that cause uncontrollable stress causes physiological damage to the body. It's a physiological problem if people have chronic stress. Reduce that stress and the health goes way up. So here's just a review. We'll walk you through the fast reaction. The brain sends a signal through the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla, the inner part of the adrenal gland, the adrenal medulla. And that causes the release of adrenaline. This reaction is very fast because it's done through nerves. So the adrenaline can kick in extremely, extremely fast. Over here, we have the hypothalamus causing the release of ACTH from the pituitary, and that floats through the blood. And this might take a few seconds. This isn't wham, this isn't instant. This might take a few seconds. This is the slow reaction. This goes to the adrenal cortex, the outer part of the adrenal gland, and that causes the release of cortisol. And that goes to cells, to the brain, and to all these places like that. These are the two reactions. So now we get into a field. It's been around for a while, but it's had a lot of popularity lately because we're starting to understand it better. A field called Psychoneuroimmunology, or sometimes just psychoimmunology. This is the relationship between behavior and actions and thoughts and the body's immune system. So the immune system guards against invading pathogens in the way of they carry these antigens. And that's like bacterias and viruses, and you're constantly waging war with them. Okay? The world is a dirty place, and you're constantly getting hit by all of these antigens. Well, you have a lot of ways to deal with that. Your skin and your white blood cells, these are all ways of blocking those invasive bacteria and viruses. But sometimes you have acquired. This is why you get immunizations when you're a kid. You get a little dose of the disease that's inactive, but it teaches your body how to recognize certain diseases. We call these a specific immunity, acquired immunity. So you get these T cells and B cells and antibodies and all these things, the thymus gland. These are all ways to combat diseases. Now, Stressors can affect the nervous system, can affect hormones, can affect behavior, can affect T cells and white cell count and B cells, and cortisol can affect the thymus. A lot of cortisol, and we can get a swelling of the thymus gland. All these things that influence your immunity. So separation, caring for Alzheimer's people, living in dangerous places, these all affect immune systems. So sometimes people can get very sick, and that's just because their immune system's compromised, not because they are, injured. There's some very famous experiments where if you take a rat and you stress the rat out, and there's lots of ways of stressing a rat out, but one way is just put the rat next to a cat. He's in a cage and he's living next to a cat. That's a terrible stressor. Now that rat might have enough water and enough food and enough exercise, but many of these rats die after a couple weeks just by stress. Okay? The cat's not attacking him, the cat is just there. And the stress response can do so much physiological damage to the body that it causes the animal to die. So let's go through something you can look up, and this is really common, the general adaptation syndrome. It's the process we go through when we go through stressors. Stress involves the whole body, and it goes through 3 stages. 1, there's the alarm reaction. The sympathetic nervous system kicks in, the adrenal gland kicks in, adrenaline, this is the fast reaction. What's happening? I want to prepare my body to deal with this. Then we get stage of resistance. Now this is where you're dealing with this stressor. You can run faster, your eyes dilate, you see more, your memory is working better, you successfully deal with this stressor. You have this adaptation energy, you're dealing with this problem. But that can only last so long. You only have so much adrenaline. You only have so much time that you can deal with a stressor, and there's a point at which there's an exhaustion phase. You run out of energy to deal with this. And even if the stressor's there, you don't have the reaction to it. And this is a time when your body can be in a lot of danger. So, here is the stressor. You have an alarm reaction, what, and then you have, okay, I'm dealing with it, I'm dealing with the problem, stage of resistance, and then eventually you get exhausted. You get exhausted from that stress. So, let's look again at some psychophysiological disorders. These are psychosomatic disorders because they're caused by stress and they're caused by events and your interpretation of those stressful events. We talked about asthma, which is very common in the Central Valley, headaches, which can be very disruptive to one's productivity, heart disease, this is the high blood pressure problem, ulcers are, as well, because here's what happens. Ulcers, like in the stomach and in the small intestine, are caused by a bacteria. You don't have the bacteria, you're not going to get an ulcer, and that's just that. But if blood is pulled away from the stomach, the blood helps to prevent. It's almost like a insulation between the stomach acids, the hydrochloric acids in the stomach, and the stomach wall. It helps to insulate it. Well, if you're putting blood away from the stomach, then it becomes exposed, and if you have that bacteria, the acid can start eating away at the stomach. It can be very dangerous. You can also get what's called a parasympathetic reflux. In other words, you're stressed all the time, and when that finally get that time, you get that time at home when you're not stressed, you actually get a lot more acid into your stomach. Parasympathetic overshoots, and that can also cause damage. The hypertension can lead to heart disease. This hypertension is your blood pumping harder. It's harder on the heart, harder on the kidneys. Blood pressure up in the brain can cause stroke. Okay? Again, stress, the mismanagement of stress can be extremely dangerous. Although an event can cause stress, it can have a positive and negative effect depending on the stress and the interpretation. So we classify these as distress and eustress. Eustress are actually pretty good. And they actually can counteract distress. Let's say you're very stressed with school and you go for a run, 3-mile run. Well, that's stressful for the body, right? That's stressful. You got to use a lot of blood and it's a little bit painful and you're breathing hard. That's a stressor. But it can be really good to reduce the distress and be healthy for your body. Going on a roller coaster ride, going bungee jumping, or doing something that's exciting. I think that's one of the reasons that scary movies are so popular now. Anytime you make a good scary movie, people go out and watch those movies. They make a lot of money. Well, because the world is a stressful place. That's a eustress. You go there and you get scared and your heart's going all over the place and you're like, that thing's jumping out of the closet, and these are stressors. But these can actually reduce the bad effect of distress. So ask yourself right now, what are you doing in your life to counteract the stress? Sometimes that can be something relaxing, but sometimes it can be something stressful, like exercising. So distress, this is bad. Distress can cause negative feelings, physical symptoms and ailments, and eustress can counteract those bad effects. These are the kinds of things that you talk about with people who have stress and anxiety and depression. One of the most common things to do is get yourself on an exercise regimen. Walk 20 minutes a day. It really does help to reduce stress or distress. There's also ways of looking at and measuring the levels of stressful events. Cataclysmic phenomenons like floods and earthquakes and war, these are really bad stressors, and these can have really bad effects on people for a very long time. Then we get into the daily hassles, and I think this is where society, especially in the United States, I think this is where we could use some work. We work a lot of hours, we go to school, we have to deal with many things. And so rising prices, you got house maintenance, tailgating. I drive into work 30 minutes every day. And it's on a 2-lane highway, and when you have somebody behind you and there's nowhere to go and they're tailgating you, I'm stressed the whole way down. I want to relax on my way to work, and that's really not so good. But then there are also daily uplifting events, things that bring us joy that help to counteract that. Times with friends, times with pets, getting enough sleep. What about that time you finish the assignment? Or what if you study really hard for my exam and you take it and you do really well? Those can be really uplifting. I'm a real believer in the idea of things in balance. Stress is not such a bad thing. A lot of stress is bad unless you're counteracting it and you're interpreting that stress in a good way. A completely stressless life is not good, I don't think. It's about balancing that stress. Distress and eustress, and as long as they're in balance, you're going to be a lot more healthy and happy. So this is kind of obvious, that stressor-stress relationship. Stressful events can produce a motivation to adjust or counteract the stressor. This is getting back to the notion of homeostasis and motivation. You get low on sugar, you're motivated to eat sugar. You get high on stress, you're motivated to reduce that stress. And when people are given the opportunity to do that, or do that in an organized way, or given help with that, they're highly motivated to do it, and it's a much more productive life. This is getting a little bit at Clark Hall's drive theory and this idea of counteracting and getting into homeostasis by creating this drive. So Holmes and Ray developed a measure of the level of adjustment. This is a way of looking at stress. They call this a life change unit. And also, what do you need to do to counteract that? It's kind of a way of quantifying stressful events and ways of reducing those stressful events. So you create this social adjustment scale, and this led to the undergraduate stress questionnaire, because undergraduates are very stressed. I gotta admit, my life is pretty stressed. I keep very, very busy, got lots of things with kids and stuff, but if I looked back on it, I think my time as an undergraduate It's probably the most stressful time. School is very stressful. I also had to work a lot, and there's just a lot of anxiety. So people are really interested in reducing stress of students, not only for their health, but for their productivity and their measure of happiness in their life. So this is how it works. Rank the following on a scale of 1 to 4. They're given a lot of things in relationship to how stressful this would be to you. So, fought with a boyfriend or girlfriend, how stressful? 1, let's go back. 1, not at all. 4, a lot. Give that a score. It's finals week. A 4, a 1, a 3, 3.5. No time to eat. That gets stressful. Got to class late. I see students coming into my class late, and sometimes they don't care, and sometimes they're just staring at me like, oh, I can't believe I'm late. I feel real bad. Sat through a boring class. I'm not sure if that's a 4, but yeah, I remember that as an undergraduate of having instructors that, that's just an hour and a half that you just have to stare at the clock. Death of a pet. For me, that's a 4. That's really high, especially a dog or an animal that we've had for a long time. Very stressful. And lack of money. Well, that's constant and chronic, and I don't know if that's a 4, but if you have a 2 every day or a 3 every day, that can get kind of bad. So here are the scores when you give this survey to a lot of people. So sat through a boring class. Well, not a 4, but 1.66. Class. Getting to class late is even more stressful. No time to eat. Stressful. Fought with a boyfriend or girlfriend. That gets up there. That gets up there. Lack of money. Death of a pet, 3.21. That's really getting high. So this is a way of monitoring and looking at people's views of stress, undergraduates' views of stress, and also ways to deal with those stress. Finals week, 3.62. How many of you, think about it, get sick right after or during finals week? This happened to me all the time. I'd take finals, and then I'd have the flu or I'd have a cold. It's the immune system. The immune system is just counteracted by all that chronic stress you experience. And of course, this is the highest one. This is 3.97. Death of a family or friend. So we'll end with this, because this is what we're going to be talking about a lot more in the next lecture on stress, the idea of chronic stress. Acute stress is not such a bad thing. Your body actually likes it and actually can kind of be good for you in some ways, especially if it's eustress, these quick events that go away. But chronic stress and your interpretation of that stress in a bad way can be extremely damaging. You've listened to a little bit of Robert Sapolsky, you've read a chapter maybe of his book. This is a really good book. You should read this, especially if you're interested in the field of health psychology. He talks about type A, type B personalities and the health problems associated with chronic stress. Why don't zebras get ulcers? Because they deal with acute stress. Lion chases them, they run away, it's over. They don't sit there and worry all day about the lion. They don't think into the future very far, and they don't ponder about the past. And so they don't get ulcers. We do that. We think so hard about the future. We're stressed about the future. We're even stressed about the past that we can't do anything about anymore. We think about all those things we should have done or could have done better. We think about the negative things in the past. We project them in the future. Humans are a very bright species. We got a big brain, but boy, we fixate on the wrong things sometimes.